And the reason that we have introduced that very strong pro-union platform is that for 45 years, there has been a war in this country waged by the corporate elite against the working class of America. And the truth of the matter, not talked about in Congress, not talked about in the media, is that as a result of that war against the working class by the corporate elite, what we have seen is the decimation of working families all across this country, while the wealthiest people and largest corporations have done phenomenally well. Now, if there is going to be class warfare in this country, it's time that the working class of this country won that war and not just the corporate elite.
So if you were like me today, guys, you woke up and you saw this fantastic tweet by Bernie Sanders, saying that his workplace democracy plan will double union membership, end right to work, end union busting, protect the right to strike for all workers, and protect benefits that are negotiated by unions under Medicare for all. This is fantastic. Bernie Sanders is the only candidate offering a definitive plan to bring workplace democracy to America. Now, what is workplace democracy, you might be asking? Well, workplace democracy is nothing more than the assertion that if we believe that society should be democratic, that democracy should not end when you go into your workplace. That democracy should not merely be for the ballot box when you elect your local and statewide and federal leaders, but rather it should extend into the day-to-day lives of working people. And there are many ways you can achieve this, but one of the most vital and one of the most fundamental ways is through stronger workplace protections that are won through unions. And so Bernie's plan today is all about strengthening Americans' access to unions and giving them more rights in the workplace to protect them from the arbitrary nature of employers. Now, to be clear, in some other cases, Bernie Sanders has talked about economic democracy in terms of workers' ownership, ensuring that workers themselves have ownership in the company, seats on the board. He's talked about workers' cooperatives. He's talked about public ownership of certain industries. All of these things are important too, but today, Bernie Sanders is focusing on unions and labor rights, and as such, we're going to be doing a sort of deep dive into the main policy pieces that Bernie Sanders has just put up on his website. So to start, Bernie Sanders lays out the broad history, which is that without trade unions, what people call the American middle class would have been impossible. And that the reason that middle class, whether it's real or it's a mythology, is under attack is because unions have declined so much since the 1970s, and that there's no, institutional force to stand for working people, not only in the workplace, but in terms of lobbying for big political changes at the local and state and national level. So Bernie Sanders says his priority is to empower working people and to empower unions to represent those working people. And he notes that unions are not just this ideological, question. Unions have real tangible benefits for working people. They earn 22% more when they're in a union. And the majority of people who have good pensions in the United States have them through unions. They're much less likely to fall victim to health and safety issues in the workplace as well. Unions in general also have a dulling effect on inequality. They make society more equal, and as I've noted in other videos, unions also fight gender and racial inequality in the workplace. In unionized workplaces, the gender and racial pay gap still exists, but it's quite a bit narrower. So if you're a champion of pay equity and health and safety and workplace democracy broadly defined, then a union is that ticket. So again, Bernie Sanders notes that there's many, many reasons for inequality in the United States, which is a fundamental issue for Bernie and I think for the country. But he notes that unions are perhaps the biggest reason. The lack of unions has sort of presaged inequality in the country. There's no doubt in my mind, at least, that you can draw a direct correlation between the rise of corporate inequality on the one hand and the decline of union membership and union strength on the other. Those two things are deeply connected. As unions became weaker, corporations became stronger. And that was not an accident. That was a purposeful decision by Republicans and neoliberal Democrats over many generations. Bernie Sanders notes here that employers know this. Employers will often tell workers that the union won't help them, that unions are just going to take their paycheck and not do much else. But if that was really true, why would employers fight unions so hard? If unions only hurt the workers themselves, why would employers put so much time and energy and resources both in their own workplaces but also in supporting anti-union politicians? Why would they do that if it was just about protecting their own staff? I don't think employers are benevolent. Employers don't like unions because unions challenge the power and greed of employers. That's the simple reason. Bernie notes this here. Employers are very, very likely to hire anti-union consultants. They hold closed-door meetings to basically indoctrinate workers against unions. Some employers even threaten to close shop and move out of state or move out of the city or what have you if a union forms. And when a union does form, employers often stonewall the negotiation of a first contract because they don't want to legitimize the union. It's very clear. Employers in the United States fear unions for a reason. And they fear unions because unions are good for the working class. And Bernie Sanders understands this and wants to put forward a series of policies that represent working people and unions. So let's go through some of these policies. Right here, Bernie Sanders says he wants to provide unions the ability to organize through a majority sign-up process. Basically, this is what we would call card check in Canada. In some jurisdictions, you not only have to sign cards, but then you have to have a vote. And it's in that intermediary period that employers can intimidate workers on an individual or collective basis. A majority sign-up process means that if you can get workers to sign the cards, a majority of people who would be reflected in that bargaining unit, that union should be formed without employer input in any way. That union doesn't need to be voted on. The majority of workers have demonstrated a desire to form a union, and that is the best way to do it. Likewise, he wants to put first contract provisions on the table. This means that employers can't just ignore new unions. If they don't reach a negotiation, Bernie Sanders will mandate compulsory mediation process, and then he would send them to binding arbitration. All of this is done to ensure that a young union, because when unions are first formed, they often lacked resources and strength and kind of institutional bases. And employers will say, well, if I just don't negotiate with them, the union will be starved of resources and it'll fade away. This ensures that employers will have to come to the table, and if they're still intransigent, Bernie will have a compulsory arbitration, which will guarantee that those workers will get a decent deal handed down by a neutral third party. And perhaps the biggest thing in this plan, there's more after this, but I think the biggest thing in this plan, Bernie Sanders is going to ban right to work. As he notes, he's getting rid of the right to work for less policy. In over half the US states, unions are basically forced to represent workers whether or not those workers pay dues. It started as a backlash against working people and their rising strength after World War II, and it's spread to so much of the country, and it effectively makes union work extremely difficult. Bernie Sanders would make it so that if you're in a unionized workplace, you have to pay dues because you're deriving benefit from that. You're deriving benefit from the negotiation process. No longer can a worker not pay their dues and still demand that the union represent them when they come up against an employer, grievance or what have you, or they're at risk of losing their job or losing their hours or what have you, and they demand the union helps them. Bernie Sanders also wants to get rid of the finagling that employers do around classification by classifying workers as independent contractors, quote unquote, or by classifying workers as, supervisors, quote unquote. You can effectively ban their right to unionize. Bernie Sanders says no more of that. We're going to make it so that working people are seen as working people, and that'll expand the right to unionize for so many people. Another key one here from my perspective is giving federal workers the right to strike. In many cases, under federal law, employees don't have the same rights as workers in the private sector. In my view, and this is based in what we have in Canada, which is our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, sort of like your Bill of Rights, it is recognized that the right to strike is a basic human right under freedom of representation. And Bernie Sanders is going to make it so that every worker, every federal worker, will have the right to strike and bargain collectively without these sort of provisions that infringe upon their human rights. As he notes, so many workers are often affected during government shutdowns, and part of the reason is that these workers have limited rights in comparison to many at the state and private sector levels. Likewise, Bernie Sanders wants to ensure that workers at the state level have the right to bargain collectively. In some U.S. states, public sector workers are effectively banned from bargaining collectively. That's an infringement on their human rights, because the right to form a union and the right to bargain collectively is a human right, and Bernie wants to ensure that every American, whether they work at the state or federal level or in the public or private sector, they will have the right to bargain collectively and strike. Another factor is that in this economy, contract flipping is so big. Companies will often merge or be bought out or be sold, and in these cases, Bernie Sanders has noted that this is often done cynically to erase existing union contracts. And so Bernie Sanders wants to make it so that if a company flips a contract to another, or a company merges or what have you, the existing union contracts negotiated by previous partners will be honored. This is another crucial point, and it shows how the power of the federal government can be used to influence private sector employers. The federal government can't in a direct way tell employers how to act, on a day-to-day basis. But what they can do is use the power of federal contracts and subsidies to compel employers to be better to their workers. So he notes that the federal government under his watch won't give contracts and subsidies to companies that don't pay a living wage, or that don't take care of their workers, or that bust unions, or that have outrageous inequalities between what the CEO earns and what the regular working man earns. And so Bernie can say to these companies, sure, fine, do what you want, but we're not going to give you contracts if you treat your workers poorly. This is another crucial point, which is the permanent replacement of striking workers will be banned. No longer can employers use the threat of replacing the entirety of a workforce under strike as a way of busting the union. Those workers are entitled to their job, and during a legal strike position, no employer should be able to tell them that they're going to permanently give their job away. I would like to see the ban of replacement workers, period. I want to see scabs not be allowed to operate even during the operation of a strike. During the strike, there should be no work done in the workplace. Whether it's by scabs or by members of the union, the workplace is shut down. If it's locked out or if it's a strike, it should stay like that until a deal is reached. No scabs at all. But this is a good start. Another one here is Bernie Sanders wants to protect pensions. Companies have used bankruptcy proceedings and other forms of creditor prioritization to basically get around their responsibility to working people and their pensions. And the reality is that pensions are not a perk benefit. They're not something that's on the side. Pensions are deferred wages. And effectively, workers are having their wages stolen from them. So Bernie Sanders wants to use tax loopholes, and he wants to use new programs to ensure that working people and their pensions are protected. If their pensions and their benefits are under assault because of company bankruptcy finagling, Bernie Sanders will stand up for them. Likewise, Bernie is also going to ban mandatory anti-union meetings in the workplace. Companies won't be allowed to force workers to sit in front of a TV as they play an anti-union video. We've seen these by Amazon or Target or so many companies. They force their hires to sit in front of these things and say why unions are bad. And, there might not be an active union drive, but in effect, it's poisoning the well of what workers might think of their options in terms of building a workplace democracy. Another crucial point is that Bernie Sanders is going to ban at-will employment. Bernie Sanders knows that in the United States, in pretty much every jurisdiction, you can basically be fired for no reason at all. Your employer can wake up one morning and just end your job, end your career. And that's not how a workplace democracy should work. No one should have such power to simply fire you for no reason at all. Bernie Sanders wants to make it so that employers would have to prove that they're firing you for a reason. They would have to have cause. Like, for instance, they can't just say, I'm firing you because I feel like it. They would have to say, well, this person has had a, consistent record of delinquency, or they've had issues with how they treat customers, and I've recorded these instances, and I've met with them to try to improve their performance, and they haven't, and I had to let them go. In that case, the employer has demonstrated just cause, and a worker could be fired. But that's fair. What's unfair is just an employer saying, I didn't like him anymore, I just wanted to get rid of him. Or I fired them to set an example. Or I fired them because, my kid was unhappy today, and I came into work all grumbly, and I fired the first person that came into my office. That is not fair, and Bernie Sanders wants to fight that. This is a crucial one right here. Bernie Sanders wants to create sectoral collective bargaining and allow municipal and state levels to do the same. This is important because in some industries, it's very hard to form individual unions in the workplace. Like in a lot of fast food places, it's really hard to form a union because they're atomized workplaces, there's high levels of turnover. As we noted above, employers will often close franchises that unionize and then open them up a few months later and then work without a union. And there's so many reasons why it's hard to unionize these places. But if you create a jurisdictional collective bargaining system based on a sector, you could make it so that every fast food employer is required to negotiate with a broad industry collective agreement that would apply to everybody, regardless of the individual employer, which would give workers broader protection and would make it less likely that an individual fast food place would just close down to open up again, because whether they were open now or later, they'd be covered under the jurisdictional agreement. This is incredibly important for precarious workers, for service workers, for gig economy workers who can be covered under these broader deals that give them greater protection, especially if you work multiple jobs. Let's say you work at McDonald's and at a local coffee shop. Maybe you're covered under a sectoral agreement that negotiates both of those workplaces. That'd be really good for you as a multi-job minimum wage worker. Another factor here is that many people are left out of the right to bargain collectively, even in the private sector. Some domestic workers and some farm workers basically aren't allowed to form unions. Labor codes are often written as such that they're excluded. They're not seen as workers, even though they're clearly workers. So even if they wanted to, they are legally unallowed to be union members. Bernie Sanders will pass a domestic workers' bill of rights, for instance, and will ensure that they have the right to form a union. Another key factor, and this relates to how employers will often force their workers to watch anti-union propaganda, is Bernie Sanders wants to expand and update the persuader rule, which is basically to have employers be more transparent about how and why they use anti-union material, and that they provide equal space for organizing agents of workers, and that they provide information about their employees to the union. The union deserves to have full transparency about the workplace they're trying to organize. And that doesn't mean that the workers have to support the union, but employers should not be allowed to use their resources to pump anti-union propaganda into their workforce while denying unions the right to access those workers in any meaningful way. And Bernie Sanders would fine companies that broke this regulation. Bernie Sanders, much like, the card check certification, the sign-up certification, wants to level the playing field for those who want to join a union. There will be cases where workers don't want a union. But Bernie Sanders wants it to be known that when a union doesn't exist, it's not because of employer harassment and employer intimidation, but because the workers themselves have made an educated decision about their options. And finally, and this is a crucial one because of how people like Joe Biden have attacked Bernie Sanders' Medicare for All plan, Bernie wants to let it be known that his transition to Medicare for All will work with unions. Bernie Sanders wants to make it so that as Medicare for All increases the general benefits of workers, employers won't pocket the difference. There's a concern that, if Medicare for All is negotiated, employers are going to save money and they won't pass that on to workers, but will pass that on to shareholders and to their coffers, and they'll invest in automation and what have you. But Bernie Sanders says no, they're going to ensure that those benefits are shared broadly by the workers. And in some cases, this could be better because workers will not only have Medicare for All, but will have more money from their employers, which can go to vacations and other forms of benefits and other forms of compensation and better retirement benefits and all of these sorts of things. Furthermore, Bernie Sanders is going to ensure that what unions have negotiated that goes beyond a Medicare for All plan will be preserved, and that unions that have negotiated specialized clinics for their members, they won't lose that. All of this is incredibly important. Bernie Sanders wants union workers to know that he respects the fight they won for individual Medicare in their workplaces, but that the real goal of labor all along has been for every working class person to have the benefits they need. And I think many union workers realize that the real goal isn't just a patchwork plan of healthcare depending on your collective agreement, but a system in which workers don't have to beg for their employers to give them healthcare, and that it'll be guaranteed as a basic human right to every man, woman, and child, and that negotiations can focus not on basic human needs like healthcare, but on better wages and benefits broadly defined. Ultimately, Bernie Sanders closes on a key point. 62% of Americans support unions, but union membership is only half as what it was a couple generations ago. That's because workers have not been given the tools they need to resist employer intimidation and to form unions in a modern workplace. Bernie Sanders will provide that, and that's why he's the only presidential candidate right now building a legitimate path towards democracy in the workplace. That's why I support Bernie Sanders, and I think that's why millions of working people will support him too.